Ashore, he served as the Commandant of the U.S. Naval Academy and the Navy's Chief of Legislative Affairs. He's the recipient of more medals than we have time to list tonight, plus several awards from foreign governments. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about the opening Arctic, please welcome Admiral Gary Roughead.
Well, Mike, thank you for the introduction, and I've been telling everyone that all my success is due to the wonderful instruction you gave me when I was a midshipman. Going to have two starts tonight. As was mentioned by Josh, we are doing a recording, and so that we don't put a big pause in the recording, there's a film clip that I would like to show, so I'm going to start with that. And what the film clip will portray is how the Arctic is changing from the standpoint of the multi-year ice that tends to form in that part of the world. I invite your attention to the ice mass. This is data. This is not a projection. This is what is happening, or what has happened. And then on the bottom of the projection, you will see a time tick by year as it moves along. And so this will probably stress my technical competence, but again, watch the ice, but most importantly, watch the time frame on. So I think that gives you a little bit of a sense of what's taking place up there. And I'd really like to also take this opportunity to thank the World Affairs Council for the opportunity to talk about the changes that are taking place in the Arctic. Again, I'd like to thank General Mike Myatt for being here supporting this, but most importantly for everything that he does to support the men and women who serve, all who serve, not just the Marines, and everything that you've done to bring our military closer to the communities in the Bay Area. So thanks for that, Mike. I really appreciate it. My interest in the Arctic goes back a ways. I think that you can't help but do what I did for almost 38 years and spend your time on the oceans and thinking about the oceans and the implications of security around the world, particularly from the standpoint of our maritime interests, and not really think about the Arctic. When I was leading the Navy, there were two areas that were of significant interest to me that I focused some specific attention on by creating some task forces, which is really an anomaly for me. I don't like to do task forces. But one was on energy. What are the future energy outlooks globally and nationally from the standpoint of being able to look and see where there may be conflict and strife and friction, but also internally, because as we all know, large organizations use a lot of energy, particularly our military forces. So I wanted to try to get the best idea as to what the future would be in the energy dimension. But then the other was climate change. And it really had a couple of components to it. One, in that as I look around the world and you see changes that are taking place, and those changes have effects on water supplies for many populations around the world, agricultural forecasts, and if you overlay demographics on where the climate is likely going to be changing, then you get a good sense of where there can be friction, where there can be needs for humanitarian assistance. And so we were looking at it from that standpoint. And then a large component of climate change is what's happening in the Arctic that you just saw. I tend not to get into what I call the theological discussions of climate change, but I look at what is happening to the planet, what does it mean for our country, what, in my case, what did it mean for the Navy, what did we have to start thinking about, and so that's where my drive toward the Arctic continued to be. And I've been pleased now to be at the Hoover Institution, where I can continue working on that with the great support of the Schultz-Stevenson Energy Task Force. And I would also like to say that with the extraordinary support of Secretary George Shultz, who personally is involved in this, has an interest in it, brings an incredible amount of perspective and insight and leadership to the work that we're doing at Hoover. So, George, thank you so much for what you're doing to help this project along. What I'd like to do tonight is just to offer some thoughts and some observations, because the project that we're working on will last into the late summer, and we'll be producing a report that will come out in the early fall. But a couple of observations to spring off of what you saw, in that the past year has been the least iced Arctic in recorded history, but at the same time it has been the stormiest Arctic in recorded history. The Arctic and the Antarctic are very different, and the simple way that I like to describe them is that the Antarctic is land surrounded by water, and the Arctic is water surrounded by land. And with that opening of the ocean, I refer to that as the most significant event that's happened since the end of the last ice age. And for people that either wear Navy blue or Coast Guard blue, when there's more water, we tend to get really excited about that. And so but we really need to pay close attention to it. When I think about the Arctic and how we're looking at the Arctic at Hoover, is you really can look at it in four ways, and they're really quite simple. For me, you have to look at the Arctic from the standpoint of what are the resources that are going to be up there and that people will seek. The other is, what about the environment? What is happening to this very pristine spot on the Earth that really has not been affected by humans over time? And then the other aspect is the indigenous population that exists in the Arctic. And then what about the security? And by security, our view and what we're working on at Hoover is not the military dimension exclusively, but what must be in place in this area that's opening up in an unprecedented way to ensure a safe, secure, and prosperous region of the world. When people talk about the resources in the Arctic, it's very easy to conjure up the image of drilling rigs and all of the activity that goes on to extract energy from the Earth, whether it's oil or gas. But there's a lot more in the way of resources in the Arctic. The largest zinc mine in the world is in Alaska, the Red Dog Mine. In Siberia, there are large nickel and copper mines. In Canada, a huge iron ore mine on Baffin Island. And in southwest Greenland, there's estimated to be 1 billion tons of iron ore. And this is not just speculation, because the Chinese have seen fit to invest $2.3 billion in southwest Greenland to go after that ore. So those, when we talk about resources, it's pretty significant. And that doesn't account for the resources that are on the seabeds. That, too, will be of value to individuals. And then when you look at the estimates on the undiscovered energy resources, 30% of the undiscovered gas is estimated to be in the Arctic, and 13% of the undiscovered oil is to be in the Arctic. And so what about the environmental issues once you move away from the resources? Because people will be coming for the resources. They already are. And so what are some of the environmental considerations that come into play? It's still a very, very harsh place. As I said, the stormiest year in recorded history. Dark most of the time. The ability to move and respond to events in the Arctic. The infrastructure, quite frankly, is not there. And Admiral Gary has led some exercises there to test and to try to determine how we as a country will respond to events that take place. The shoreline, as a result of the climate change that's taking place, is changing dramatically. The ice is breaking off from the shore. In some cases, the ice is crushing into the shore as it moves around. The permafrost is melting and heaving up the earth, so the structures, if there are any there, are being damaged and in some cases destroyed. And as that permafrost is melting, you're releasing large quantities of methane gas into the air. There will be, as the warming trend continues, a movement north of vegetation and insects. And what will that do with regard to disease vectors that may be carried by those insects? So there are a lot of environmental considerations that are going to come into play, and how do we respond to those, and what's the best way to respond to them? When we looked at indigenous populations in the Arctic, their way of life is gone forever, a way of life that for millennia they have lived as a subsistence culture of hunting and sealing and fishing and whaling. Their communities will no longer be in positions to be able to do that. They are being influenced in a way by the internet that pulls them away from their traditional beliefs and values and ways of life and that subsistence culture. So that's having a change. 4 million people live in the Arctic, and that 4 million is beginning to migrate a bit. During the Soviet Union and in the high north of the Soviet Union, there was forced settlement and forced communities. As the Soviet Union disappeared and there was more freedom, many of those people have moved. And a lot of the resource industries that are beginning to be developed in the Arctic, third countries are starting to come into play. Large numbers of people from Central Asia, Poland. There's even a large Thai community up in some of the areas working on some of the energy and the resource issues. And it's that population that also distinguishes the Arctic from the Antarctic. 4 million people live above the Arctic Circle. No one lives in the Arctic. A lot of penguins, but not people. When we look at the security requirements, a need to be able to support and respond and react to the events that are taking place. And when we look at security, as I've said, it's about safety, response for environmental or other accidents that could take place up there. And it's there that our Coast Guard is going to be on the front lines of anything that happens in the Arctic. So what we're doing is looking at what's the most thoughtful, what's the best way to move forward, because it is changing quickly, and we are an Arctic nation. If you go to Alaska, you come away knowing you're an Arctic nation. If you go into the lower 48, I'm not sure that you come away with that same sense. But nonetheless, we're at a period of time where with this change that's taking place, that we have to start making some strategic decisions. We have to start making some investments. We have to decide how we want to posture ourselves in the Arctic, and we're having to do it at a time when we don't have a lot in the way of budgetary flexibility. And so we can develop strategies, we can develop plans, but a strategy, in my mind, without a budget is nothing more than a wish. And so we hope to be able to inform some of the thinking. So areas that we're going to be looking at are, for example, the infrastructure. How do we put in place the airfields, the bases, the staging of equipment that may be required to respond to some of the challenges. We only have one deep water port in the Arctic, Dutch Harbor, Alaska. And I'll leave it to Paul, but it's probably about as far from the Arctic as you can get in Alaska. But it's still considered to be an Arctic port, and it truly is. The other thing that we face is, even though it looked like all of the ice was flushed out of the Arctic Ocean, the fact of the matter remains that ice, like politics, is local. And you may find areas where the ice is closed harbors or closed shipping routes. And so how do we clear that? And one of the challenges that we as a nation have, and more specifically the Coast Guard has, is our icebreaking fleet. And even though it may look like it's all gone, icebreakers will be required to get in and out of places that are going to be important to us and others economically. They will be required to respond to events, whether it's a search and rescue operation or an environmental problem. And let me just give you a sense of the Arctic nation's icebreaking capability. Russia has 43, Sweden has 9, Finland has 9, Canada has 13, and the United States has 1. And I think it's around 40 years old, a great ship.
Bringing the second one on.
Bringing the second one on.
40 years.
40 years. And so how do we think our way through that, and what's the best way to reconstitute that capability that will be required? Ships that operate in the oceans today aren't equipped, aren't hardened, don't have the systems on board that will allow them to operate in that harsh, cold, and at times rough climate. And so those are some investments that have to be made. Communications and navigation in the Arctic is very different. When you get above about 74 degrees north latitude, the communications that are so much a part of how we move around the world today aren't as robust, are more spotty. They don't have the capacity that we've become so used to in the world in which we live. When we look at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, only about 10% has been surveyed. So as you look at a nautical chart, where many surveys have been done in other parts of the world, 10% has been done in the Arctic, and most of those surveys are between 50 and 80 years old. So we have a little bit of a backlog, I would say, to deal with. But we're pleased as we look at these challenges of communication and navigation to be able to be embedded in Stanford University, where we're getting some great support there, and also from Georgia Tech, where they have been thinking about this problem for quite some time. The other area that will come into play in the Arctic is shipping. As that ocean opens, it becomes sea routes that will connect the world in different ways than we've ever seen before. There's been a significant change in the percentage of shipping, but I would also say that we have to be mindful that that's also the law of small numbers. But that will continue to increase. And as I look at shipping, I kind of think of it in 5 ways. We have fishing. We have the shipping that will support resource exploration and exploitation. We have tourism that is already taking place in a significant way. We have support of, or we have the destination shipping that will go from one port in the world, perhaps to some of these mining areas, to an offshore oil or gas terminal, and that's what we refer to as the destination shipping. And then there's the transit shipping, ships that will move through the Arctic, either through the Northwest Passage, which is over Canada, the Northern Sea Route, which abuts Russia, or the Transpolar Route, which goes over the top of the pole. With respect to fish, the fish are going to migrate, but I think there's still some scientific uncertainty as to what will happen. 1/5 of the world's fish exist around the Arctic Circle, right around the edge of what we're talking about. And they're beginning to migrate north. But what will happen when they get into the Arctic? Because the fish that are on the edge normally start their first 2 years of life near the surface, and then as they age, they begin to live down near the bottom. But the Arctic is much deeper than where they live now. So what will that disruption do? The problem of ocean acidification is problematic because it's in that disruption to the food chain where, because of acidification in the ocean, coral is stunted, shellfish are not able to generate the shells that are their protection, and so the food chain becomes disrupted there. What's the effect on the fish population in the high north as a result of that? And then there's stratification, which is the fresh water melts and settles on top of the salt. It'll put in place a layer, and the food chain of plankton and other things that float from the bottom to the top might not be able to penetrate through that strata. In fact, there was a great article in The Economist magazine. They refer to it as the tequila sunrise because of the layering. And so if you're a sailor, you can identify with things like that. But those are some things that are going to affect the fishing fleet. But the fishing fleets are going to migrate north. The Coast Guard will have to deal with enforcing the regulations and the takes and our interests. And again, that's another aspect of the Arctic that has to come into play. Tourism, as I said, has taken off in 2013, and the Coast Guard's most recent strategic or Arctic strategy is forecasting over 1 million tourists in the Arctic next year. And during one of our workshops at Hoover, someone had a great picture of a large cruise ship with thousands of people on it, weaving in and out of the icebergs up there. And then I immediately recalled the picture of the Costa Concordia laying on its side off the coast of Italy, where those people could just jump into the water and swim ashore. What's going to happen in the Arctic where you don't have the infrastructure to go after them? And that's why the infrastructure piece, in my mind, is so very important to be able to do that. I think the challenges of extraction are going to be the same, and the shipping that supports that. When Shell was working off the coast of Alaska, they had a number of ships up there that I think both Paul and I would be envious to have in our own services. But it will require that significant amount of shipping up there. With respect to transit shipping, I think there's a question mark that we're beginning to see there, because so much of the transit shipping that we see coming in and out of San Francisco Bay or wherever it may be, the large container ships, about 50% of what they carry are really components. So they're part of a global supply and manufacturing chain where timely delivery is what's important. And when you have an environment where you can't predict the time it may take you to go through there, or if you have to change the sea route based on the season, the shippers are not ready to go there yet. And so I'm not sure we're going to see the amount of transit shipping that many are forecasting, but we're going to be giving that a very good look. And so as you see the shipping pick up, what are the rules that people have to abide by? What is the code that you want in place from a safety perspective? How do you want the crews certified? What are the physical characteristics of the ships? What are the requirements for them to be able to respond to an environmental problem? And that's going to be a challenge, and I was pleased this week where the International Maritime Organization has come out with an intention to have a polar code in place by 2016 for polar shipping. But then what are some of the indemnification rules that will come into play? And how do ships get insured, and what's the best way to deal with insurance as ships move through what is going to be a fairly challenging place? And I've touched on infrastructure, the infrastructure ashore a couple times. And I think we have to look at, because of the budgetary environment we're in, I think we're going to have to look at public-private partnerships that can support the range of activities that are taking place in the Arctic. How do you power the Arctic so that you're not emitting things that will only exacerbate the changes that we're seeing. And so we're going to be spending some time looking at what the energy requirements are going to be there. And then as you develop all of this, and as others use the Arctic Ocean, who pays when you have a problem? Because it will be the Arctic countries that will respond to the problem, and that will come at cost. So what are the role of the other countries that are using that? And that brings into play the governance of that space. And right now, I often talk about the Arctic as being the most cooperative place on the planet, and arguably, apart from the weather, the most benign place on the planet. The Arctic nations, the 8 Arctic nations, and those that and the indigenous communities that are represented there, it really is, I think, a model of significant cooperation. And I believe it is very important that that governance model and that level of cooperation is maintained as we go into the future. One of the things that will be happening is Canada has just taken over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And in 2 years' time, in May of 2015, the United States becomes the chair of the Arctic Council. And I think we have an opportunity, working closely with our Canadian friends, of being able to develop a continuum of initiatives and work in progress that could be very, very helpful. But we're also looking at some of the legal dimensions of the Arctic. As these new transit routes come into play, and as countries look at the routes that may come in through some of their territorial seas, what are the requirements, and how does that affect our view toward what have become accepted international norms and accepted elements of maritime law? And will there be initiatives to change that in ways that are helpful or perhaps not optimized? But those are some of the governance issues that we're going to be taking a very good look at. And then, of course, there's the issue of claims in the Arctic. Talked about the resources that are up there, and the exclusive economic zones of each country are fairly well defined. They're not fairly well defined. I think they're very well defined. But then there's an issue of the extended continental shelf, what extends beyond our exclusive economic zone. And the United States is extraordinarily fortunate to have projections of an extended continental shelf that are really quite generous and quite prosperous. But the problem is, those claims are going to be adjudicated through something called the Convention on the Law of the Sea, of which the United States is not a party. And the amount of area and the wealth that we are talking about is absolutely extraordinary. The estimates on the extended continental shelf are 2 times the size of the Louisiana Purchase. The big difference is that we had to pay for the Louisiana Purchase. We don't have to pay for the extended continental shelf. But unless it's adjudicated through UNCLOS, as we call it, chances are we're not going to get it. And as one of my Coast Guard colleagues said, it's as if the United States is holding the Powerball winning lottery ticket, and we are absolutely refusing to cash it in. And so that's where we are, and I think that's going to be problematic. And then the other question relative to our accession to the Convention on the Law of the Sea is we will become the first chair of the Arctic Council that is not party to that treaty. And what are the implications of that? And we have some terrific maritime and international lawyers that are looking at that for us. And then what are some of the regulations and policies that we have in place that will allow a responsible, practical means of addressing the Arctic issues? And I'm not sure that we're well positioned there, because I think if you look at what has happened recently, some of those companies that have been interested in doing some work in our area have decided that they will move elsewhere. And what are the implications of that? So those are some of the things that we're looking at. It's a fascinating place, as you can tell, because it does take into into account so many different aspects of a place that is truly unique in our time and, quite frankly, in this period of recent history in which we live. Because, as I've said, we have not had an ocean open since the end of the last ice age. And so we have an opportunity in this very cooperative environment that exists there to be able to think our way through. But now's the time when we have to start making some decisions on what are the policies, the procedures, and then how do we make sure that we are treating the Arctic in the right way and resourcing it in a way that allows us to have that safe and secure and prosperous environment that will benefit our country. So with that, I will stop, and Mike, I turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Admiral. It's fascinating. You make a very good case for us being parties to this treaty, the law of the sea. Why is it that we're not?
I think those who have opposed the treaty really raised two issues. One is that as a nation, and particularly as our naval forces, and by that I mean our Navy and our Coast Guard, will relinquish the sovereignty that is so important to us. And I will tell you that in my view and in the view of many who have really spent their life working on the treaty, that is not correct. The provisions in the treaty are very, very clear that we would not be inhibited in any way from any of the activity that we currently undertake anywhere in the world. The other aspect is the concern on the part of some who think that a provision in the convention where wealth that is taken from the seabed and you pay a royalty as a result of that, that we would potentially be providing resources to those that are harmful to our interests. But if you look at the structure of that royalty scheme, it is not that much. And if we were to become party to the treaty, there's a provision where the United States has unequaled authority to address the disbursement of those. And so those who argue that we could potentially be giving money to those who are harmful to our interests, I'm having a hard time with the logic, because by not being party to the treaty, we have no control. If we are party to the treaty, we essentially have total control. So those are the two areas that I think have hung most people up. But there's just somewhat of an emotional reaction to any treaty that carries the moniker of UN on it. It tends to be avoided.
Is there an opportunity for the Senate to address this treaty in the near future?
There is always an opportunity to address it in the near future. I think, though, that when you look at the legislative agenda, you look at the legislative year, and then you look at the political seasons that we're about to embark on, it will become very challenging to have the treaty addressed in what I consider to be some short windows. But that said, I believe it is extremely important that we are party to the treaty, and I think it is extremely important that we are party to the treaty before we become the chair of the Arctic Council.
You mentioned the Arctic Council, and we are not a member of party to the treaty, and there's several questions on the Arctic Council and its transition to a policy-making body. What do you foresee as the future points of emphasis for the United States, knowing that we're not a member of party to the treaty?
I think the United States, because we comply with UNCLOS in essentially every way, I really do think that our agenda will be the same as if we were party. I think that the areas that we will be most focused on, and there's been very good progress, for example, in the search and rescue agreements among the Arctic nations. I believe that there will be additional cooperation in environmental response. I believe that there will be an emphasis on resolving some of the shipping issues and the process of regulation and how that is dealt with in the Arctic. I also believe that the countries of the Arctic Council will also look at the dimension of business in the Arctic and how should that be addressed, and so those are the types of things that I think the Council will take up, and also throughout that they will be very focused on the well-being of the indigenous populations that are in the Arctic.
Several questions about our relationship with Canada in relation to the Arctic. And it asks, what is the role of Canada? Are they assisting us with assets?
I think Canada has obviously a very strong focus on the Arctic. Their Prime Minister for a couple of years now has been very focused, very public on the importance of the Arctic for Canada. We have long cooperated with Canada on a variety of, whether it's exercises, response to real events. And so I would characterize our relationship as very close. I believe that both countries will want to remain mindful of the policy development that's going on, the investments that are being made. And also, as we get into the Northwest Passage and some of the navigational issues, there will be great interest on the part of both countries on how that shakes out.
Well, let's segue the question, do you see any resolution between the U.S. and Canada regarding the Northwest Passage routes that pass through Canada?
I think that's going to be a work in progress.
Yeah. Several questions on icebreakers. Why do we have only one icebreaker?
I probably should turn that over to my Coast Guard friend here. But no, I think that what has happened over time, and I think that right now the Coast Guard, not only is there only one icebreaker with the second one coming on, but even though I focused on the Arctic, the Coast Guard has the responsibility still of supporting our operations down the Antarctic. So it's not just one icebreaker for the Arctic, it's one icebreaker for the two poles. And what has happened over time is the priorities have shifted, and we find ourselves in the situation where we are in. And I think that the important part to remember is, as I mentioned a couple of times, that even though it looks like all the ice has gone away, one could argue that the icebreaker fleets in the Arctic could be busier because there's more activity and they have to assure access and response in ways that they haven't had to before. So the issue of icebreakers is going to be a very important one for the country. Coast Guard, as best as I can tell, has laid in some money to begin the design of an icebreaker. But I think we all know there are great pressures on the budget, and I'm hopeful that that the nation will see fit to make the investments the Coast Guard needs to get into a recapitalization.
There is a question here, can the U.S. buy or lease icebreakers from Canada, Norway, or Sweden rather than build our own?
I would say that is an option. That's something that we're going to be looking at as we work on our project. But the other aspect is that looking at the total ice-breaking fleet in the Arctic is something that I know will be on the docket, but clearly we have to look at how we can best recapitalize ourselves, and that to me would be an option.
This shifting to the environmental issues, the environmental community has been very negative towards any energy exploration in the Arctic. Example of Greenpeace campaign against Shell. Do you see any positive resources or impacts that the energy industry is bringing to the region?
I think that the technology that has gone into being able to extract the resources safely has been extraordinary. I believe that The support that the companies that have been up there have put into the operations have been quite extraordinary, and you look at the amount of money that they have paid or that they have spent to conduct operations up there, it's extensive. And so I think that we will see a continued emphasis on the technology, continued emphasis on environmental responsibility and on safety. And I personally believe that that it can be done in a responsible way.
If we had an oil spill like we had in Louisiana, what would be the impact in the Arctic?
It would be significant and different because Admiral Gary led the effort in the Gulf, and he had many ports from which to work: Houston, New Orleans, Gulfport, to support that. The weather conditions in the Gulf at the time were relatively benign, and there was a great mobilization that was able to be put into place. Airfields along the Gulf Coast are extensive, so you could move things in and out quickly. As I said in my remarks, that doesn't exist in the Arctic. How ice will behave and how it may trap under the ice layers is something that could be problematic because it may be trapped in there for periods of time. How you clean up oil from ice is different than how you clean up oil from water. And so there's some significant issues, and it would be a challenge. And a large part of it is we simply don't have the infrastructure to be able to stage and operate out of in the Arctic that we have in other parts of the world.
Continuing on that line, said, how deep is the Arctic, and do we have the infrastructure and technology to drill in the Arctic?
Obviously the seabed varies in depth, but most of the exploration has been fairly close inshore. So we're at least heretofore have not been at some of the depths that Deepwater Horizon was at, but it's still a very challenging place to be. But the depths seem to be a bit less than what we've seen.
Shifting to the other nations' interest in the Arctic, can you list what are the Arctic nations that are members of the Arctic Council?
The Arctic Council is the United States, Canada, Russia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and I think I got all 8. Right? Yep. And then there's a set of observers to the Arctic Council. That number is now up to 12. And just this past May, 6 were added as observers who don't have the same access and stature as the 8 Arctic nations have. But the 6 that were recently added were the Republic of Korea, Japan, Singapore, Italy, China, and pardon? No, I do have it. I apologize, but we can get that. But the observers are increasing in number, and if you look at who has been added as an observer, one, it's either a shipping interest or a resource interest, and so I think that will be the trend that you will have.
Well, you mentioned, this is another question, you mentioned China is investing heavily in the Arctic. How is the U.S. investing in the Arctic?
I think I'm reasonably safe to say not as heavily as China. China has begun to develop a more robust ice-breaking fleet. They also are very keen on the mineral deposits. I mentioned Southwest Greenland. And I think that we will see China being very interested in the transportation and the mineral resources in the Arctic.
This is interesting, this question, sir, because we talked about it earlier. As the shipping level increases in the Arctic, do we envision a problem with piracy?
I had this question once before, and my comment was that it's still going to be very cold up there, and I think the would-be pirates will just have so many clothes on they won't be able to climb on the ship. So they'll look like Michelin men running around. But I think that in the near term, to see activities such as we see in the Somali Basin, I don't see that happening for some time.
It's comforting, sir.
There you go.
Here's a question. I'm not sure I understand this. I understand the production of Prudhoe is diminishing. When do you expect it to no longer be profitable? What will happen to Catabik then? Maybe the person that wrote that question
Could probably answer it better than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
My understanding is that the oil production in Prudhoe Bay has been declining.
Right.
Do you have any idea when that will no longer be viable?
I do not know. Paul?
Probably within 10 years. Right now, the throughput is about 40% of when that was first opened. So clearly, as you look at Alaska and its revenue source from oil in particular, is highly incentivized to bring new oil and gas. Now, out of the Chukchi Sea, where one of these production sites would be, you have to reconstitute one half of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system. That has to cross over 100 navigable waterways. Each one of those requires an environmental impact statement. So there's infrastructure, there's red tape involved, but time is running out. There are 6 cooperative companies that have invested in TAPS, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. If 1 or 2 of those pull out, there's a likelihood that all of them may, and then that's shut down altogether. So that's a very real risk.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to consider as we look particularly at energy in the Arctic, it has to be viewed in the context of the global energy changes that are taking place. And I would submit that up until a couple of years ago, there would be a train of thought that would have had a lot of the Arctic energy coming down into the lower 48. But now with the advances and the boom that's taking place with regard to fracking and the shale oils, what will happen, what will the demand be on the Arctic energy? And now that says it would apply to the United States. That said, there are still great demands in Asia for energy. And so will those energy sources find their way to Asia as opposed to coming down into the lower 48? And I think it has to be looked at in that context. And I think it's very different than it was even just 5 years ago before things started taking off down in the lower 48.
Sir, as your role as the Chief of Naval Operations, did you look at a different kind of Navy to deal with the Arctic than you currently have today?
There was no question that we would need different types of ships to operate up there, but not great numbers of them. But they would have to be designed to be operated to operate in that environment. They'd have to be hardened. They'd have to be able to not be as prone to ice accumulation. They'd have to be ships that had very different ventilation systems in them, because the ships that we operate today are really optimized toward the middle latitude bands. And so that would have to happen. But I would also say that we were looking intently at unmanned systems, particularly unmanned underwater systems, because the beauty of an unmanned system is that it can do the dull and the dangerous, and you don't have to risk a human being. And so I think that there are opportunities for unmanned technology to move forward, and also to be able to be employed in the scientific work and exploration that has to take place. Because, as I said, so much of the Arctic is not surveyed, so unmanned systems can do that much more efficiently, I believe, than manned systems can do. And then there are also the communication architectures that need to be put in place. And you have to make decisions about, particularly for the Navy and the Coast Guard, which ones do you want to have total control over? What aspects of communication are you willing to ride on commercial systems? And so those were some of the things that we were looking at as we tried to decide how we were going to invest our money in the Arctic future.
So this next question is, I think it's a personal question from a friend of yours. It says, Gary, as we rode past the northern slope of Canada, it appeared wild where Alaska was heavily refined by oil. Why has Canada developed so much less? Also, thank you for advice on our Arctic road.
Okay. I think that the push we had up into Alaska was really about energy. I think that we're going to see Canada bringing on some of the resources, and clearly some of the mining interests I think are going to be very strong in Canada.
Sir, we're actually running out of questions here. I think you answered a good many of your questions in your presentation.
Great.
But I want to thank you so much for what you're doing on this project. It's very, very interesting, and I would like the audience to help me thank Admiral Gary Roughead.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you.